You're standing in a dimly lit chamber deep beneath the Egyptian desert, the air cool and impossibly dry against your skin. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs that seem to dance in the flickering light of your torch, telling stories of gods and pharaohs, of death and eternal life. Before you rests a sarcophagus, its painted surface still vibrant after thousands of years. Inside lies someone who walked these same desert sands when the pyramids were new, their body preserved so perfectly that you could still see the lines of their face. This isn't decay, this is transformation. This is humanity's most ambitious attempt to deny death itself. Did you know that some mummies are so well preserved that scientists can identify their last meal? Or that mummification wasn't unique to Egypt, as cultures separated by oceans and millennia independently developed their own methods of preserving the dead. Tonight on Midnight Deep Dive, we're unwrapping the ancient art of mummification, from the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to modern cinema screens. We'll explore how humanity learned to preserve flesh and bone against the ravages of time. So settle in, close your eyes, and let yourself drift peacefully as we uncover the mysteries wrapped in linen and lost in time. Imagine being an early archaeologist in the 1800s, breaking through the sealed entrance of a tomb that hasn't been opened in 3,000 years. Your lamp illuminates the darkness, and there, resting in elaborate painted coffins, are human beings who look as though they might simply be sleeping. Their skin, though darkened with age, remains intact. Their hair is still carefully arranged. Their hands are folded peacefully across their chests. Everything about them suggests they died yesterday, not millennia ago. The shock, the wonder, the profound unsettling nature of seeing death so perfectly preserved. This moment changed how we understood both ancient civilizations and the very nature of human mortality. The discovery of mummies represents one of humanity's most profound encounters with its own past. When early explorers first encountered preserved bodies, they struggled to understand what they were seeing. Some believed these were victims of some terrible calamity, frozen in time by supernatural forces. Others thought they might be elaborate sculptures or artistic representations rather than actual human remains. The idea that bodies could be intentionally preserved for thousands of years was almost too incredible to believe. But preserved bodies weren't entirely unknown to ancient and medieval peoples. Occasionally, natural conditions would preserve corpses in ways that seemed miraculous. A body buried in peat bog might emerge centuries later, skin intact and features recognizable. A traveler lost in mountain snows might be found decades after death, frozen in perpetual youth. These accidental mummies inspired both fear and fascination, often becoming objects of religious veneration or sources of supernatural legends. What makes intentional mummification so remarkable is that it represents humanity's conscious decision to fight against nature's most fundamental process, decomposition. In the normal course of events, death leads swiftly to decay. Bacteria that live harmlessly in our bodies during life begin breaking down our tissues within hours of death. Insects arrive to contribute to the process. Within days or weeks, soft tissues disappear, leaving only bones behind. This is nature's way, recycling nutrients, making room for new life, maintaining the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Mummification says, not this time, not for this person. This body, this vessel that carried a soul through life, deserves to last forever. The impulse behind mummification is deeply human and profoundly moving. It emerges from love, from respect, from the desperate hope that some part of the person we knew might continue to exist in recognizable form. It's the same impulse that makes us preserve photographs of loved ones, save their belongings, visit their graves. We want something tangible to remain. Different cultures developed mummification independently, separated by vast distances and thousands of years, yet united by this common desire. The ancient Egyptians, famous for their elaborate preservation techniques, weren't the first or only people to practice mummification. The Chinchorro people of coastal Chile began mummifying their dead around 5000 BCE, more than 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummies. In the high mountains of Peru, the Inca practiced mummification as part of their most sacred religious ceremonies. In Europe, bodies preserved naturally in peat bogs were sometimes recovered and reburied with ceremony, suggesting recognition of something sacred in their preservation. Each culture's approach to mummification reflected their unique beliefs about death, the soul, and the afterlife. For Egyptians, preservation of the body was essential because the soul needed a physical home to return to. The body was not a discarded shell, but a crucial part of eternal existence. For the Chinchorro, even tiny infants received elaborate mummification, suggesting beliefs about personhood that extended to the very youngest members of their society. For Incan cultures, certain individuals, particularly those selected for sacred sacrifice, were preserved as intermediaries between the living and the divine. The techniques varied as widely as the beliefs. Some cultures removed internal organs, recognizing that these soft tissues would decay first and needed to be treated separately. Others left the body intact, using external treatments to prevent decomposition. Some used elaborate chemical processes involving salts, resins, and herbs. Others relied on natural conditions, extreme cold, complete dryness, or the unique chemistry of peat bogs, to achieve preservation. Despite these differences, all shared the fundamental understanding that decomposition could be prevented through careful treatment and favorable environmental conditions. What's fascinating is how sophisticated this understanding was. Ancient embalmers didn't have modern microbiology or chemistry, yet they understood empirically that certain substances prevented decay. They knew that removing moisture was crucial. They recognized that some plant compounds had preservative properties. They understood that protecting the body from insects and scavengers was essential. This knowledge was accumulated over generations, passed down through apprenticeship and practice, refined through countless trials and experiments we can only imagine. The discovery of mummies in the modern era opened entirely new windows into ancient life. These weren't just preserved bodies. They were time capsules containing information about diet, disease, genetics, daily activities, and even emotional bonds between the living and the dead. A mummy's stomach contents could reveal what people ate. Their bones could show what physical labor they performed. Their DNA could map migration patterns and family relationships. Their teeth could indicate childhood nutrition and health. Every mummy was a library of information, waiting to be read by those who knew how to look. Early archaeologists, unfortunately, often treated mummies more as curiosities than as human remains deserving of respect. Bodies were unwrapped at public events, ground into medicine, or displayed without consideration for the individuals they once were or the descendants who might still honor their memory. This history of exploitation has led to important modern conversations about ethics, respect, and the proper treatment of human remains. Today, we recognize that mummies are not merely scientific specimens or museum exhibits. They are people who lived, loved, suffered, and died, and who deserve to be treated with the dignity appropriate to human remains. The story of Egyptian mummification begins not with elaborate ceremonies and priestly rituals, but with an accident of geography and climate. Imagine the earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley burying their dead in simple graves scooped from the desert sand. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth to temperatures that killed bacteria before they could begin their work of decomposition. The sand absorbed every trace of moisture from the body, creating conditions so hostile to decay that flesh simply dried rather than rotting. When later generations accidentally disturbed these graves, they discovered something miraculous. Their ancestors, preserved almost perfectly by nothing more than hot sand and dry air. These accidental mummies must have had a profound impact on ancient Egyptian religious thought. Here was tangible evidence that the body could persist after death, that the physical form didn't have to disappear into dust and bones. If the body could be preserved by chance, imagine what might be achieved through intentional effort and divine guidance. This observation, combined with developing religious beliefs about the soul's journey after death, sparked one of history's most sophisticated and enduring funerary traditions. Early Egyptian religious texts speak of the soul as composed of multiple parts, each with its own nature and needs. The Ka was a spiritual double, a life force that needed sustenance even after death. The Ba was something like personality or individuality, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could move between the tomb and the world of the living. The Ak was the transformed, glorified spirit that could dwell with the gods. But all of these spiritual components needed something crucial: the body, preserved and recognizable as an anchor point and eternal home. Without the body, the Egyptians believed, the soul components would be lost, wandering without purpose or destination. The person would suffer a second, final death, not just the death of the body, but the death of the eternal self. This made preservation of the body not just a nice gesture, but an absolute spiritual necessity. It was quite literally a matter of eternal life or eternal death. The evolution of Egyptian mummification techniques spanned thousands of years. From simple sand burials to the elaborate 70-day process reserved for pharaohs and the wealthiest nobles. Early attempts at improvement actually made things worse. When people began burying their dead in wooden coffins or stone tombs to protect them from scavengers, they inadvertently created conditions perfect for decomposition rather than preservation. Bodies that would have dried naturally in the sand instead rotted in the sealed, humid environment of a tomb. This setback led to experimentation with chemical preservation. The Egyptians discovered natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate found in dry lake beds. Natron had remarkable desiccating properties. It could draw moisture out of organic matter while also creating an alkaline environment hostile to bacteria. It was, essentially, the perfect natural mummification agent, and its discovery transformed Egyptian funerary practice. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egyptian embalmers had refined their techniques to a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern chemistry. The process they followed was both scientifically ingenious and deeply ritualistic, combining practical preservation techniques with religious ceremonies designed to transform the deceased from a corpse into an eternal being. The embalmers themselves occupied a unique position in Egyptian society. They were part priest, part surgeon, part chemist, possessing specialized knowledge that was carefully guarded and passed down through families or temple schools. They worked in special workshops called pernefer, or houses of beauty, often located on the west bank of the Nile, the side associated with the setting sun and the land of the dead. The work was considered both sacred and somewhat polluting, requiring ritual purification before and after. The embalmer who made the initial incision wore the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the afterlife. This wasn't mere theatrical gesture. In Egyptian belief, the embalmer literally became Anubis during the procedure, transforming a human act into a divine ritual. The deceased wasn't just being preserved by human hands, but was receiving the direct ministrations of a god. The quality of mummification varied dramatically based on wealth and social status. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described 3 different levels of service, ranging from the elaborate to the economical. The most expensive treatment involved the full 70-day process with removal of all internal organs, extensive use of expensive imported resins and oils, and elaborate wrapping, with hundreds of yards of the finest linen. The middle tier might skip some of the more expensive materials, but still follow the basic preservation procedures. The cheapest option involved simply washing out the body's interior with a purging liquid and drying it in natron for the prescribed period. Even among the wealthy, not everyone received royal-quality mummification. Pharaohs and their immediate families enjoyed the absolute best treatment, with the most skilled embalmers, the finest materials, and the most extensive rituals. Their mummies were works of art as much as preserved bodies, gilded, decorated, adorned with jewels and amulets, wrapped in linen so fine you could see through it. Lesser nobles received excellent treatment, but perhaps not quite so elaborate. Priests and scribes, valued members of society, received good quality mummification appropriate to their status. But here's what's beautiful about Egyptian mummification. Even the poorest members of society who couldn't afford elaborate preservation were still treated with dignity and ritual. They might be wrapped in simple linen and buried in plain graves, but the basic religious observances were still performed. The spells were still spoken. The deceased was still sent on their way with prayers for safe passage to the afterlife. In death, if not always in life, every Egyptian deserved the chance for eternal existence. The religious framework surrounding mummification was extraordinarily complex and beautiful. The process was accompanied by the recitation of spells from collections like the Book of the Dead, which provided the deceased with passwords, warnings, and guidance for navigating the dangers of the underworld journey. Each stage of the embalming process had its associated prayers and rituals. The wrapping of each finger and toe was accompanied by specific incantations. The placement of protective amulets between the layers of linen followed precise rules. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition. A dangerous journey through the Jewet, the underworld, where the deceased would face challenges and judgments before emerging transformed and eternal in the field of reeds, a paradise described as an idealized version of Egypt itself. The preserved body served as both anchor and refuge during this journey, a place the soul could return to for sustenance and safety. The day after death, the body begins its 70-day journey of transformation. In the Pernefer, the house of beauty, embalmers in white linen gather around the deceased, who lies on a slanted table designed to allow fluids to drain away. The air is thick with the scent of incense, frankincense and myrrh burning in braziers to mask the smell of death and to sanctify the space. This is sacred work, and it begins with prayer and purification. The embalmer wearing the mask of Anubis approaches first, his jackal-headed disguise transforming him from man into God. What follows is part medical procedure, part religious ritual, and entirely focused on a single goal: defeating death through preservation. The first and most crucial step involves removing the internal organs, which would decay first and fastest if left in the body. The chief embalmer makes a careful incision in the left side of the abdomen, about 4 inches long, using a razor-sharp blade of obsidian or bronze. This cut is more than functional. It's symbolic, echoing the wound that the evil god Set inflicted on Osiris in the mythological cycle of death and resurrection that underpins all Egyptian mummification practice. Through this incision, the embalmers reach into the body cavity with skilled hands and specially designed hooks, removing organs with practiced precision. The liver comes first, dark and dense. Then the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. Each organ carefully extracted and set aside for individual treatment. These organs aren't discarded as waste. They're considered essential components of the person that must be preserved separately and eventually entombed alongside the mummy. But one organ receives different treatment. The heart stays in the body. To the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the seat of intelligence, memory, personality, and soul. The brain, by contrast, was considered relatively unimportant, mere cranial stuffing with no known function. So while the heart remains nestled in the chest cavity, the brain is destroyed and removed through the nose in a procedure that sounds brutal but requires remarkable skill. The embalmer inserts a long bronze hook, resembling a narrow spoon with a hooked end, up through the nostril and into the cranial cavity. With careful manipulation, they break through the ethmoid bone, the delicate structure separating the nasal cavity from the brain. Then comes the delicate work of liquefying the brain tissue using the hook, stirring and breaking it down, until it's fluid enough to drain out through the nose when the body is turned face down. The cranial cavity is then flushed with various liquids, perhaps wine or plant extracts with antibacterial properties, before being packed with resin-soaked linen to maintain the head's shape. This procedure leaves no external mark except for slight damage inside the nostril, preserving the deceased's appearance while removing an organ that would otherwise decay and cause significant problems during preservation. The skill required to perform this procedure successfully, navigating blind through small openings, breaking down tissue without damaging the face, ensuring complete removal, speaks to the surgical expertise that Egyptian embalmers developed over centuries of practice. With the organs removed, attention turns to the extracted viscera. Each organ is washed in palm wine for purification and then covered in natron to dry, just as the body itself will be. Once desiccated, these organs are wrapped individually in linen and placed in canopic jars, containers specifically designed for this purpose. These beautiful jars, carved from limestone or alabaster, have lids shaped like the heads of the 4 sons of Horus, each of whom protects a specific organ. Imseti, with his human head, guards the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, protects the lungs. Duamudef, with the head of a jackal, watches over the stomach. And Kebe-Senuf, falcon-headed, safeguards the intestines. Now comes the most crucial phase, desiccation. The body cavity is washed thoroughly with palm wine and cleansed with water from the Nile, water that carries the blessing of the river that gives Egypt life. Then the embalmers pack the interior with natron, filling every space where organs once resided. They cover the exterior of the body completely with more natron, creating a pristine white blanket of desiccating salt. The body is left in this state for 40 days, during which the natron performs its miraculous work. The chemistry of natron is fascinating. It doesn't just absorb moisture like regular salt. It actively pulls water out of tissues through osmosis, while simultaneously creating an alkaline environment that inhibits bacterial growth. The sodium compounds in natron prevent putrefaction. The fats are saponified into a stable form, and proteins are denatured in ways that prevent decay. The result is tissue that's completely dried but maintains much of its structure and form. Skin becomes leather-like and darkened but remains intact. Muscles shrink but don't disappear. The body becomes, essentially, a stable organic structure that will last for millennia if properly protected. After 40 days, the natron is removed and the embalmers assess their work. The body has lost significant moisture and weight, perhaps 75% of its original mass. The skin has darkened to brown or black. The body has contracted somewhat, becoming more compact, but the form remains recognizable, the features preserved. Now begins the work of restoration and beautification. The body cavity is packed with new materials, not natron this time, but bundles of linen, sawdust, or sometimes even sand, all soaked in resin. This packing restores the body's natural shape and provides additional protection against decay. The incision in the abdomen is sewn shut or covered with a protective plate bearing the Eye of Horus, a powerful protective symbol. Sometimes, small incisions are made in the arms and legs, which are then packed as well to prevent the limbs from appearing too shrunken. The embalmers now turn to cosmetic restoration. The skin is massaged with oils and unguents made from plant resins mixed with beeswax and aromatic substances. This treatment gives the skin a subtle sheen and provides an additional protective layer. The face receives special attention. The cheeks might be packed with linen to restore their fullness, the eyes filled with small linen pads or stone substitutes to prevent the eyelids from sinking. Some mummies show evidence of henna being applied to the nails and hair. False eyes made of stone or painted linen might be placed in the eye sockets. The goal is to make the deceased look as lifelike and beautiful as possible. Then comes one of the most meditative and sacred parts of the entire process, the wrapping. This isn't a simple matter of winding cloth around a body. It's an elaborate procedure that can take 15 days and uses hundreds of yards of linen strips of varying widths, each strip consecrated and each layer accompanied by prayers and the placement of protective amulets. The wrapping begins with the fingers and toes, each digit wrapped individually with the finest linen. Then the hands and feet, the arms and legs, each limb treated separately before the torso wrapping begins. As they wrap, the embalmers place amulets between the layers. Scarabs to protect the heart, jade pillars to provide stability, tight knots to invoke the protection of Isis, and many others. Each amulet is positioned according to precise rules laid out in funerary texts. Each has specific prayers that must be recited during its placement. The wrapping pattern is complex, crisscrossing the body in ways that distribute pressure evenly and create a secure, protective cocoon. Every 7 to 8 layers, the wrappings are coated with warm resin, creating rigid, protective shells. The wrapping gradually builds up until the body is encased in multiple layers, transforming from a recognizable human form into a stylized figure. The final layers might include shrouds painted with protective images or decorated with elaborate bead nets. The head receives special treatment during wrapping. The embalmer carefully wraps the face, often placing a painted portrait mask over it before the final layers. These masks, with their serene expressions and idealized features, represent the deceased not as they were in death, but as they will appear in eternal life. Young, beautiful, perfect. Throughout this entire 70-day process, priests perform daily rituals. They burn incense, make offerings of food and drink, and recite spells from sacred texts. The family of the deceased might visit, bringing gifts and participating in ceremonies. The mummification is not a hidden, secret process, but a communal act of love and devotion, with many people contributing to the successful transformation of their loved one from mortal to eternal being. Finally, on the 70th day, the mummy is complete. It's placed in its coffin, or more often in a nested series of coffins, each more elaborate than the last, and prepared for the funeral procession and the final journey to the tomb. The opening of the mouth ceremony will be performed at the tomb entrance, symbolically restoring to the deceased the ability to breathe, eat, speak, and see in the afterlife. The mummy will be placed in the tomb, along with everything needed for eternal existence: food, drink, furniture, games, jewelry, and the precious canopic jars holding the preserved organs. While Egyptian mummies capture most of our attention, they represent just one chapter in humanity's global story of death and preservation. Thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, along the arid coast of what is now Chile, another culture was perfecting their own mummification techniques at a time when Egypt was still learning to farm. The Chinchorro people, fisher folk who lived along the Pacific coast, began intentionally mummifying their dead around 5000 BCE, a full 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummies. This wasn't borrowed technology or shared knowledge. This was independent invention, born from different beliefs and different needs, yet addressing the same fundamental human desire to preserve the beloved dead. What makes Chinchorro mummification particularly moving is who they chose to preserve. While Egyptian mummification was initially reserved for the elite, the Chinchorro mummified everyone: wealthy and poor, adult and child, even fetuses and infants who died before or shortly after birth. The elaborate treatment given to the very youngest members of society suggests a culture that viewed personhood as beginning at or before birth. that considered even the smallest life worthy of the most careful preservation and commemoration. The Chinchorro techniques were remarkably sophisticated and varied over their 3,000-year practice. The earliest method, called black mummification, involved completely disassembling the body. The embalmers would remove the skin carefully, like a suit of clothing. They'd remove all organs and muscle tissue, defleshing the bones completely. Then they'd reassemble the skeleton using sticks as internal supports, pad it with clay and grass to restore the body's shape, and finally reattach the original skin, patching any gaps with sea lion hide. The head received special attention, with the face modeled in clay to recreate the person's features. The entire mummy was then painted with manganese paste, creating the distinctive black finish that gives this technique its name. Later, the Chinchorro developed red mummification, which involved less extensive dismantling, but still required removing the head and internal organs, reinforcing the body with sticks, and covering everything with a distinctive red ochre paste. Still later, they adopted a mud coating technique that was simpler but no less respectful. Each evolution reflected changing practices and beliefs, yet all maintained the core commitment to preservation and commemoration. The Chinchorro mummies were not hidden away in sealed tombs. Evidence suggests they were kept in homes or public spaces for periods of time, possibly allowing families to maintain relationships with their deceased relatives before eventual burial. This practice of keeping the dead present among the living appears in many cultures and speaks to the human difficulty of accepting death's finality, the need for gradual separation rather than immediate loss. Moving north and centuries forward, we find the Incan Empire of Peru practicing mummification as part of their most sacred religious observances. The Inca believed their emperor was a direct descendant of the sun god, and when an emperor died, he didn't cease to rule. He simply ruled from the afterlife. The emperor's mummy would be preserved with extraordinary care, dressed in fine clothing, and kept in the palace. During important ceremonies, the mummies of all past emperors would be brought out and seated in order, continuing to participate in state affairs. Offerings would be made to them, and their opinions would be consulted on important matters. But perhaps the most haunting Incan mummies are the Capacacha children. Young people, usually between 6 and 15 years old, selected for the highest honor and most terrible fate, human sacrifice. These children were chosen for their physical perfection and beauty. They were taken to Cusco, the capital, where they were honored, feasted, and dressed in the finest clothes. Then they were led high into the Andes Mountains to sacred peaks where they were given corned beer to dull their senses and left to die of exposure in the bitter cold. The altitude and extreme cold naturally mummified these sacrificial victims, creating some of the best preserved ancient remains ever discovered. The most famous are the children of Lulelaco, found in 1999 at an altitude of 22,000 feet. 3 children, a 13-year-old girl, a 6-year-old girl, and a 7-year-old boy, sat perfectly preserved for 500 years, their skin intact, their organs still present, even the contents of their last meals preserved in their digestive systems. They look as though they're sleeping, these children who died so young in service to gods they never doubted. The preservation of these sacrifice victims tells us profound things about Incan religion and society. These children weren't being murdered. From the Incan perspective, they were being elevated to the status of immortal intermediaries between humanity and the divine. Their preservation was natural but also intentional, as the locations were carefully chosen for conditions that would ensure the bodies remained intact. The children would watch over their communities forever, blessing the crops and protecting the people from harm. It's a belief system that's difficult for us to understand, yet it speaks to the seriousness with which these cultures approached the intersection of life, death, and the divine. Halfway around the world, in the peat bogs of northern Europe, another form of preservation was occurring entirely by accident. Yet the results are so remarkable that some wonder if ancient peoples might have understood, at least intuitively, the preservative powers of these wetland environments. Bog bodies are among the most haunting mummies ever discovered. Their skin turned leather brown by the tannins in peat, their features preserved in expressions that seem fresh despite being centuries or millennia old. The Toland man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, appears to be sleeping. His face is peaceful, eyes gently closed, a slight smile on his lips. The rope that was used to hang him is still around his neck, the knot carefully preserved. He died around 400 BCE, possibly as a human sacrifice, possibly as an executed criminal. We'll never know for certain, but the peat bog's unique chemistry, acidic, low in oxygen, with antiseptic properties from sphagnum moss, preserved him so perfectly that the stubble on his chin is still visible, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes still apparent. Hundreds of bog bodies have been discovered across northern Europe, most dating from the Iron Age. Many show evidence of violent death. They were strangled, had their throats cut, were struck on the head, or died through combinations of these methods. This triple death has led scholars to suggest ritual sacrifice, possibly offerings to the gods of these liminal places. Bogs that were neither land nor water, that existed in the boundary spaces between the human world and the wild. The preservation in peat bogs is so complete that we can see these people's last meals in their stomachs, examine their fingerprints, and even extract readable DNA. One bog body had a distinctive hairstyle, swept up and held in place with pine resin. A Bronze Age fashion statement preserved across 2,000 years. Another had rope burns on his wrists and evidence of torture before death. These aren't just bodies. They're time capsules of individual lives, complete with personal details that make them feel immediately human and relatable. In Japan, a radically different form of mummification was practiced by certain Buddhist monks seeking the ultimate form of enlightenment through an agonizing process called sokushinbutsu. Self-mummification. These monks followed a brutal regimen lasting thousands of days, gradually eliminating all body fat and moisture while they still lived. They would eat only nuts and seeds, then only bark and roots, drinking tea made from the toxic sap of the urushi tree, which killed parasites and bacteria that might cause decay after death. Finally, when they felt death approaching, they would be sealed in a stone tomb barely larger than their bodies, sitting in the lotus position, with only an air tube and a bell. Each day, the monk would ring the bell to signal he still lived. When the bell fell silent, the air tube would be removed and the tomb sealed completely. After 3 years, the tomb would be opened. If the body had successfully mummified, the monk was considered to have achieved enlightenment and became an object of veneration. If the body had decayed, the monk was buried with honor but not worshipped. Of the hundreds who attempted this practice, perhaps 24 succeeded in becoming sokushinbutsu. These mummies can still be seen in temples across northern Japan, seated in meditation, their bodies darkened and dried but still maintaining their form, testament to both religious devotion and extraordinary self-discipline. In Sicily, the Capuchin catacombs of Palermo contain thousands of mummies preserved through dry air and special treatments, displayed in niches along the walls. Unlike most mummies, which are wrapped or coffined, these are dressed in their finest clothes and arranged as though still participating in society. You can walk through corridors lined with lawyers in their professional robes, children in their best outfits, priests in their vestments, all standing or lying in dignified poses, creating a strange and moving portrait of a community that refused to let death separate them from their loved ones. Each of these mummification traditions, Chinchorro, Incan, bog burial, sokushinbutsu, Sicilian, emerged from unique cultural contexts and religious beliefs, yet all share the common human impulse to preserve, to remember, to maintain some physical connection with those who have passed. The methods vary wildly, from the elaborate reconstruction of the Chinchorro to the passive preservation of peat bogs. The beliefs differ profoundly, from the Incan concept of ongoing imperial rule to the Buddhist pursuit of enlightenment through self-denial. But the core motivation remains constant: love, respect, and the hope that death might not be the absolute end of existence that it appears to be. Sometimes the most remarkable mummies are created not by human hands, but by nature herself, when conditions align perfectly to preserve bodies in ways that seem almost miraculous. These natural mummies offer us the most intimate glimpses into ancient lives, preserving not just bones but soft tissue, clothing, last meals, and even final expressions. Moments frozen by accident, but preserved with a perfection that intentional mummification rarely achieves. On September 19, 1991, two German hikers were walking high in the Erztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy when they noticed something brown protruding from the melting ice. They assumed it was the body of an unfortunate mountaineer who had died recently. When they reported their discovery, authorities began the recovery process, still thinking this was a modern hiking accident. Only when archaeologists examined the body and the artifacts found with it did the stunning truth emerge. This man had died approximately 53 years ago, making him the oldest naturally preserved human ever discovered in such remarkable condition. Ötzi the Iceman, as he came to be called, had been caught in a snowstorm while crossing a high mountain pass. He had taken shelter in a rocky gully, perhaps already wounded from the arrow that was later found embedded in his shoulder. The snow covered him, then more snow accumulated, and eventually ice formed over his body. The glacier that entombed him acted like a natural freezer, maintaining temperatures cold enough to prevent decay while the ice protected him from scavengers and the elements. What makes Ötzi extraordinary is the completeness of preservation. His skin, though darkened and dried by 5,000 years of cold storage, remains largely intact. His internal organs, though shrunken, are still present and available for study. His hair, his fingernails, even the contents of his stomach survived the millennia. We know what he ate for his last meals: ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and various plant materials. We can see the tattoos on his body. 61 marks made with soot rubbed into small cuts, possibly a form of ancient medical treatment for chronic pain. We know he suffered from arthritis, intestinal parasites, and Lyme disease. We know his blood type. We've sequenced his genome. His clothing and equipment tell us even more. He wore a cloak woven from grass, leggings made from goat hide, a bearskin hat, and shoes insulated with grass. He carried a copper axe, evidence of metalworking technology in the Alps earlier than previously thought. He had a bow that wasn't yet finished, a quiver of arrows, a flint dagger, and a container for carrying embers to start fires. In his possession were birch bark containers, possibly for carrying food, and various tools for equipment maintenance. He was, essentially, a walking time capsule of Copper Age technology and daily life. But Ötzi also reveals something darker. The arrowhead in his shoulder, the cut on his hand that was still healing when he died, and the head trauma he suffered all suggest that his final days were violent ones. He wasn't simply caught in a storm. He was fleeing from or fighting with someone. His last hours were spent in fear and pain, climbing to high altitudes while wounded, possibly hoping to escape pursuit. The man who discovered a frozen mountain past 5,000 years ago died there, and the ice kept his final story intact for us to read millennia later. The extreme cold that preserved Ötzi works because it halts all biological processes. Bacteria can't function at freezing temperatures. Chemical reactions slow to near zero. Ice crystals form in tissues, which does cause some damage, but the overall structure remains intact. As long as temperatures stay below freezing and the body remains protected from physical disturbance, it can persist in this frozen state indefinitely. The high-altitude mummies of the Andes owe their preservation to the same principle, as do more recent remains found in glaciers and permanent snowfields around the world. At the opposite extreme, extreme dryness can preserve bodies just as effectively as extreme cold. The Atacama Desert of Chile is one of the driest places on Earth, with some areas receiving no measurable rainfall for decades or even centuries. In this hyperarid environment, bacteria cannot survive. They need moisture to live, just as all organisms do. Without bacteria to cause decay, without moisture to enable chemical breakdown, bodies simply dry out and persist, sometimes for thousands of years. The natural Chinchorro mummies we discussed earlier were likely inspired by accidentally preserved bodies that the coastal people discovered in the desert. Before they developed intentional mummification techniques, they would have occasionally found perfectly preserved ancestors in the dry sand. Bodies that had been buried and forgotten, only to emerge later looking almost as they had in life. These discoveries must have seemed miraculous, suggesting that the desert itself was sacred, that the dry earth had special powers to preserve the dead. The chemistry of extreme dryness preservation is elegantly simple. Decomposition requires moisture for bacterial growth and for the chemical reactions that break down organic compounds. Remove the moisture, and these processes cannot occur. The body's water evaporates or is absorbed by the surrounding environment, leaving behind dried tissue that's remarkably stable. Skin becomes like leather, muscles become fibrous and tough, internal organs shrink but maintain their basic structure. The result isn't as lifelike as cold preservation, but it's equally effective at maintaining the body's form for indefinite periods. Peat bogs create yet another unique preservation environment through an entirely different set of conditions. Sphagnum moss, which dominates these wetland environments, releases tannins as it decays, the same compounds used to tan leather from animal hides. These tannins literally tan human skin, turning it brown and leather-like while preventing decay. The bog water is extremely acidic, with pH levels low enough to inhibit bacterial growth. The waterlogged environment is also depleted of oxygen, which further slows decomposition. Finally, the cold temperatures of northern bogs contribute to the preservation effect. The combination of these factors creates preservation conditions so unusual that bog bodies often show effects not seen in other types of mummies. Bones actually dissolve in the acidic bog water, becoming soft and pliable, while the skin and soft tissues are beautifully preserved. This means that bog bodies often collapse when removed from their preservative environment, as there's no skeletal structure left to support them. But the trade-off is that we get incredible preservation of skin, hair, and even internal organs, allowing us to study these ancient people in remarkable detail. Salt environments create another natural mummification pathway. In salt mines or areas with high natural salt concentrations, bodies can be preserved through the same desiccating effect as natron in Egyptian mummification. Salt draws moisture out of tissues through osmosis, while creating conditions hostile to bacterial growth. The salt miners discovered in the ancient Duzlak salt mine in Iran, dating back 250 years, were preserved so well by the salt that their skin, hair, and even some clothing remained intact. The oldest of these salt men is thought to have been killed in a mine collapse, his body preserved by the same salt he was mining. Volcanic eruptions, while catastrophic for the victims, can create unusual preservation conditions. The most famous examples are from Pompeii and Herculaneum, destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. The bodies weren't preserved as mummies in the traditional sense. The soft tissues decayed over time, but the volcanic ash that buried them hardened around the bodies, creating perfect molds. When archaeologists discovered these voids in the hardened ash, they began filling them with plaster, creating casts that show the victims in their final moments. Huddled together, trying to protect themselves, frozen in death by volcanic fury. Cave environments can also preserve bodies under the right conditions. Caves maintain relatively constant temperatures and humidity levels throughout the year. Some caves have naturally dry conditions or good air circulation that prevents decay. Others have conditions that favor mummification through slow drying. Cave burials are found worldwide, and in many cases, the bodies placed there have been naturally mummified by the cave's microclimate. The Guanche people of the Canary Islands placed their dead in caves, where the volcanic rock's properties and the dry climate combined to create natural mummification. Each of these natural preservation environments teaches us something about the conditions required to prevent decay. Whether through cold, dryness, chemical action, or unique microclimates, successful preservation requires interrupting the normal processes of decomposition. Understanding these natural methods not only helps us appreciate the ingenuity of cultures that developed intentional mummification techniques, but also guides us in how to preserve and protect the mummies that continue to emerge from ice, sand, and bog, as climate and human activity reveal what nature has hidden for centuries or millennia. The discovery of natural mummies continues even today. As glaciers retreat due to climate change, they're revealing bodies that have been frozen for decades, centuries, or even thousands of years. Each discovery is both a scientific opportunity and a reminder of the individuals these were. People who had lives, families, stories that ended in circumstances that happened to preserve their bodies for us to find. They connect us across vast stretches of time, these accidental ambassadors from the past, preserved by nature's perfect accidents. When researchers first slide a mummy into a CT scanner, they're about to perform an autopsy without making a single cut. A miracle of modern technology that would have seemed like magic to the ancient embalmers who preserved these bodies. The scanner rotates around the mummy, taking thousands of X-ray images from different angles. Computers process these images, building up a three-dimensional model of everything inside. Bones, dried organs, amulets placed between wrapping layers, even the tools that ancient embalmers accidentally left inside body cavities. We can examine a 3,000-year-old person in more detail than their own physicians could have, reading their life story written in bone density, dental wear, and the subtle marks that disease and injury leave on human remains. The science of studying mummies has exploded in recent decades, as technology has provided increasingly sophisticated ways to peer inside these time capsules without damaging them. Traditional unwrapping. The public spectacles of Victorian England, where mummies were literally torn apart for entertainment, destroyed invaluable information and treated human remains with appalling disrespect. Today's researchers understand that every mummy is irreplaceable, a unique archive that must be studied with the least invasive methods possible, while still extracting maximum information. CT scanning reveals extraordinary details. We can see healed fractures from childhood injuries, arthritic changes in joints from years of hard labor, dental abscesses that must have caused agonizing pain, and evidence of diseases that plagued ancient populations. In Egyptian mummies, researchers have found evidence of tuberculosis, pneumonia, heart disease, and even cancer. We can see the effects of parasitic infections, schistosomiasis from the Nile's waters, trichinosis from undercooked pork, and various intestinal parasites that were endemic in ancient populations. The technology also reveals the embalmers' techniques in unprecedented detail. We can see exactly how they removed the brain, which route they took through the nasal cavity, how thoroughly they extracted the tissue. We can identify the materials used for packing, whether linen, sawdust, or sand. We can see the elaborate network of amulets placed throughout the wrappings, each positioned according to religious requirements. In some cases, we've discovered embalmers' mistakes. Tools left inside bodies, incomplete organ removal, or hasty repairs to damaged tissue. DNA analysis has revolutionized our understanding of ancient populations. From mummy tissue, we can extract genetic material that tells us about family relationships, population migrations, and even ancient diseases. The DNA of Tutankhamun and other royal mummies revealed a family tree riddled with incest. Pharaohs marrying their sisters and half-sisters, leading to genetic problems including the club foot and cleft palate that Tutankhamun suffered from. This genetic analysis solved long-standing mysteries about relationships between various pharaohs and helped us understand the succession of Egypt's ruling dynasties. Ancient diseases are particularly fascinating subjects for study. Some mummies show evidence of malaria, including the genetic markers for the specific strains that infected them. We've found tuberculosis DNA in mummies from ancient Egypt, Peru, and other cultures, helping us trace how this disease spread across human populations. The famous Tyrolean Iceman Ötzi carried the bacteria for Lyme disease in his tissues, proving that this tick-borne illness has afflicted humans for at least 5,000 years. Parasitology, the study of parasites, benefits enormously from mummy research. Parasites and their eggs can survive in mummified tissue, and examining them tells us about sanitation, diet, and living conditions in ancient times. Egyptian mummies are particularly rich in parasitic evidence, showing high rates of schistosomiasis from bathing and working in the Nile's waters. These tiny snail-transmitted parasites would have caused chronic illness, drained energy, and contributed to the relatively short lifespans of ancient Egyptians despite their sophisticated medical knowledge. Dietary analysis reveals what ancient people actually ate, not just what they grew or raised. Stomach contents can be analyzed directly when they're preserved. Isotope analysis of bone and tissue can show the relative proportions of different food types consumed over years or even decades. We've learned that Egyptian workers ate more fish and poultry than previously thought, that Peruvian mummies consumed significant amounts of marine resources even when living far inland, and that some ancient populations had more varied diets than others. One particularly poignant discovery involves a technique called pollen analysis. Pollen grains are remarkably resistant to decay and can survive in mummy tissues for millennia. By identifying the pollen in mummies' lungs, digestive tracts, or surrounding their bodies, researchers can determine what season they died in, what plants were flowering at the time, and sometimes even what flowers were placed with them during funeral ceremonies. The analysis of pollen from Tutankhamun's mummy revealed that he was buried with cornflowers, lotuses, and other flowers. Gentle offerings from mourners who loved him, still identifiable 3,000 years later. The molecular biology of mummification itself is a field of study. How exactly does desiccation preserve tissue? What happens to proteins, lipids, and cellular structures during the mummification process? Researchers have discovered that successful mummification creates a kind of biological amber. The removal of water and the addition of preservative substances like resins create conditions where molecules remain in place, unable to move or react, frozen in their last configuration. This understanding helps museums and conservation specialists develop better methods for preserving and displaying mummies without causing further deterioration. Facial reconstruction techniques bring mummies to life in a very different way. Forensic artists and specialists work from CT scans to digitally rebuild faces, adding muscles, skin, and other soft tissues according to standardized rules about tissue depth and anatomical relationships. The results are often startlingly lifelike. We've seen what Tutankhamun, Ramesses the Great, and many others likely looked like in life. Not the stylized, idealized faces from painted coffins and statues, but real human faces with asymmetries, distinctive features, and individual characteristics. These reconstructions transform mummies from mysterious ancient objects into recognizable people, making them more relatable and human to modern audiences. Chemical analysis of mummy tissue, wrappings, and associated materials reveals information about ancient technology and trade. The resins used in Egyptian mummification came from trees that didn't grow in Egypt. They were imported from Lebanon, Somalia, and other distant regions, evidence of extensive trade networks. Analysis of pigments used in wrappings and coffins shows sophisticated chemistry, with Egyptians creating specific colors through careful mixing and heating of minerals. Even the linen used for wrapping tells stories. Fine linen required advanced textile technology and significant labor investment, marking the social status of the deceased. Modern technology continues to develop new ways to study mummies. Portable X-ray fluorescence devices can analyze chemical composition without removing samples. Advanced imaging techniques can distinguish between different types of soft tissue that look similar in standard CT scans. Proteomics, the study of proteins, can identify specific tissues and materials even when DNA has degraded too much for genetic analysis. Each advance brings new insights into how these people lived, what they believed, how they died, and how their communities honored them after death. Perhaps most importantly, the science of studying mummies has become more respectful and thoughtful. Researchers now collaborate with descendant communities when possible, seeking permission and guidance about appropriate treatment of remains. Studies are designed to answer specific questions rather than simply satisfying curiosity. The knowledge gained is shared broadly, contributing to our understanding of human health, history, and cultural practices. Every mummy studied adds to our collective knowledge, helping us understand our shared human past and the diverse ways that different cultures have approached the universal challenge of death and remembrance. The lights dim in a 1932 movie theater, and on the screen, a young archaeologist sits at a desk in the Cairo Museum, examining ancient artifacts by lamplight. Behind him, unnoticed, a sarcophagus lid begins to slide open. Bandaged hands emerge, followed by a figure wrapped in ancient linen, its eyes gleaming with terrible awareness. The mummy of Imhotep, played by Boris Karloff in a performance that would define the monster for generations, takes its first shuffling steps toward the terrified archaeologist. The movie poster promised it comes to life, and audiences were both horrified and thrilled by the idea of ancient Egyptian dead returning with dark purposes. Universal Pictures' 1932 film, The Mummy, established nearly every trope that would define mummy movies for the next 90 years. The cursed tomb, the forbidden love transcending death, the supernatural powers of the resurrected corpse, the hapless archaeologists who disturb what should have remained undisturbed. All of these elements were crystallized in this early horror masterpiece. But perhaps most significantly, the film transformed mummies from objects of scientific curiosity into monsters, taking something that was fundamentally about preservation and love and turning it into a source of terror. The genius of Karloff's Mummy was how it tapped into multiple anxieties simultaneously. There was the fear of death itself, of course, but also fear of the foreign and exotic, fear of ancient curses and supernatural revenge, and the unsettling idea that tampering with the dead might have consequences. The mummy was the perfect monster for an era when Western archaeologists were indeed ransacking Egyptian tombs, shipping artifacts back to museums and private collections, and treating ancient remains with casual disrespect. The mummy's revenge was, in some sense, entirely justified. These archaeologists had disturbed a sacred rest, violated a tomb, and stolen treasures. The monster was the consequence of colonial exploitation, wrapped in bandages and brought to terrible life. The visual of the mummy itself became iconic. The shuffling walk, the outstretched arms, the rotting bandages trailing behind. This image was so powerful that it transcended the original film, becoming a universal symbol recognized across cultures. Children dress as mummies for Halloween, wrapping themselves in toilet paper. Cartoons parody the slow, relentless pursuit. The bandaged monster became part of our shared visual vocabulary, instantly recognizable even to people who have never seen the original films. As Hollywood evolved, so did the mummy. The 1940s brought sequels and variations, with mummies pursuing lost loves, seeking revenge, or being controlled by modern cultists seeking to harness ancient power. These films were often less about horror and more about adventure, with the mummy serving as an exotic obstacle to be overcome. The emphasis shifted from the mummy as monster to the mummy as plot device, a MacGuffin wrapped in linen. The 1959 Hammer Films version, starring Christopher Lee, brought technicolor gore and more explicit violence to the mummy formula. Now audiences could see the mummy in full color. The yellowed bandages, the desiccated flesh, the horrible vitality of something that should be dead. The violence was more graphic, the kills more brutal, and the mummy more explicitly a killing machine driven by ancient vengeance. This was the Mummy for a new generation of horror fans who wanted more visceral thrills. But perhaps the most significant reinvention came in 1999 with Stephen Sommers' The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. This film took the basic elements of mummy lore and reimagined them as a swashbuckling adventure in the style of Indiana Jones. The Mummy, played by Arnold Vosloo, was no longer a slowly shuffling monster, but a powerful, charismatic villain with supernatural abilities, and an army of the undead at his command. The film was less horror and more action-adventure, filled with spectacular CGI effects, humor, romance, and the kind of pulp adventure spirit that had animated the original 1930s serials. The 1999 Mummy and its sequels were enormously successful, proving that the mummy concept could be updated for modern audiences. Imhotep wasn't just a mindless monster, but a tragic villain, a high priest whose forbidden love led to his terrible punishment. When resurrected, he sought to bring his lover back to life, making him almost sympathetic despite the carnage he caused. The films walked a clever line between respecting Egyptian mythology and history, while also playing fast and loose with facts for entertainment purposes. These modern mummy films introduced new elements that have become part of mummy mythology. The idea that the mummy could regenerate by absorbing life force from victims, that ancient Egyptian magic could grant supernatural powers, that disturbing a mummy's rest would trigger elaborate curses affecting entire expeditions or even cities. The scarab beetles burrowing under skin, the flesh-eating curses, the armies of mummified priests. None of this has any basis in actual Egyptian beliefs, but it all felt appropriate to the mythology Hollywood had built up around mummies. Video games embraced mummies as enemies and obstacles with enthusiasm. In early games like Castlevania, mummies were slow but tough opponents who could soak up damage. As games became more sophisticated, so did their use of mummy mythology. Tomb Raider sent Lara Croft into ancient tombs filled with mummy guardians and curses. Age of Mythology let players command Egyptian units, including mummies. Assassin's Creed Origins recreated ancient Egypt in stunning detail, allowing players to explore pyramids and tombs while learning about real mummification practices alongside the game's fictional conspiracy theories. The appeal of mummies in gaming is multifaceted. They're perfect dungeon guardians. They belong in tombs and ruins, they're visually distinctive, and they can be as slow and shambling or as quick and dangerous as the game requires. Egyptian aesthetics translate beautifully to game design, with hieroglyphics, golden treasures, elaborate architecture, and the ever-present sense of ancient mystery. Games can play with the tension between archaeological discovery and supernatural horror, letting players experience both the thrill of uncovering ancient secrets and the terror of awakening what should have remained buried. Children's media has transformed mummies into figures of humor rather than horror. Scooby-Doo has featured mummies in countless episodes, almost always revealing them to be criminals in costume rather than actual supernatural threats. Hotel Transylvania features Murray the Mummy as a friendly, jovial character. Children's books present mummies as lonely figures seeking friends or as silly monsters who keep losing their bandages. This sanitization of the mummy makes the concept accessible to younger audiences, while stripping away the cultural and spiritual significance that real mummies held for the people who created them. The mummy's curse has become such a common trope that it's almost a joke. Yet it reflects real anxieties about tampering with the dead and disturbing sacred spaces. The curse supposedly placed on those who opened Tutankhamun's tomb became legendary, despite being largely fictional. Lord Carnarvon did die shortly after the tomb's opening, but from an infected mosquito bite, not a supernatural curse. The curse narrative was largely created and perpetuated by newspapers looking for sensational stories. Yet it persisted because it articulated something many people felt instinctively, that removing mummies from their rests and displaying them in museums might be disrespectful, might indeed carry consequences. Modern attempts to reboot the Mummy franchise, including Tom Cruise's 2017 The Mummy, have struggled to capture the magic of earlier versions. Perhaps we've moved beyond the point where mummies can be straightforward monsters or villains. Our understanding of cultural sensitivity, of the importance of treating human remains with respect, of the problematic aspects of colonial-era archaeology. All of these make it harder to present tomb raiding and mummy disturbing as heroic adventure, without moral complexity. Yet mummies persist in popular culture precisely because they embody such rich symbolic material. They represent death that refuses to stay dead, the past reaching into the present, ancient civilizations with secrets we're still uncovering, and the consequences of disturbing what was meant to remain undisturbed. Whether as monsters or as tragic figures, as sources of humor or horror, mummies remain compelling because they remind us that the dead were once living people with hopes, fears, loves, and beliefs, and that how we treat them says something important about who we are. The first time you encounter a mummy in a video game, it's usually in a dark corridor of some ancient temple, your torch casting flickering shadows across hieroglyphic-covered walls. You hear the shuffling footsteps first, that distinctive slow, relentless approach. Then you see it, a bandaged figure lurching toward you, arms outstretched, somehow both pitiful and threatening. You might laugh at how slowly it moves, but then you realize it's blocking your only exit, and its companions are emerging from the shadows behind you. This is the video game Mummy experience, combining archaeological adventure with supernatural threat, turning tombs into playgrounds where ancient dead serve as obstacles between players and treasured rewards. Gaming has had a long love affair with Egyptian aesthetics and mummy mythology. From the earliest 8-bit adventures to modern open-world epics, game designers have recognized that pyramids, tombs, and mummies provide instantly recognizable visual shorthand for mystery, danger, and ancient power. The appeal is multifaceted. Egyptian settings are exotic and familiar simultaneously, elaborate enough to be visually interesting, but simple enough to render even with limited graphics capabilities. Mummies make perfect enemies. They're humanoid enough to be relatable threats, but dead enough that players don't feel guilty about destroying them. In the Castlevania series, mummies appear as tough mid-tier enemies, usually wrapped in distinctive bandages and attacking with surprising reach. They move slowly but absorb significant damage, teaching players the importance of patience and pattern recognition. The design is classic horror movie mummy, shambling posture, trailing bandages, implacable advancement. They're often found in library or castle sections, guarding ancient knowledge or blocking access to powerful artifacts. This positioning reflects the mummy's role as guardian, something protecting treasures or secrets from unworthy intruders. Tomb Raider built an entire franchise around archaeological adventure, and mummies feature prominently in several games. Lara Croft explores Egyptian tombs filled with elaborate traps, puzzles based on hieroglyphics and ancient mechanisms, and yes, mummies that reanimate when she disturbs their rest. The games walk an interesting line between respecting real archaeology and embracing pulp adventure tropes. Players learn actual information about Egyptian history and culture, while also fighting magically animated mummies and dodging boulder traps that no actual tomb ever contained. The Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy offered a unique twist. One playable character is a mummy named Tutankhamun who's been cursed and must navigate challenges using his undead nature as an advantage. He can't die permanently, allowing for puzzle solutions involving self-harm or sacrifice. He can fit through small spaces and interact with other undead creatures. The game presents mummification not as horror, but as transformation. A change in state that brings new abilities and perspectives. It's a rare example of gaming letting players experience mummy existence from the inside rather than just fighting mummies as enemies. Age of Mythology, a real-time strategy game, lets players command Egyptian forces, including mummies, as powerful late-game units. These aren't shambling horror movie monsters, but elite warriors, reflecting actual Egyptian beliefs about the honored dead serving protective roles. The game incorporates real Egyptian mythology, with gods granting powers and mythological creatures serving as units. Mummies fit naturally into this framework as supernatural guardians commanded by those who know the proper rites and prayers. Assassin's Creed Origins represents perhaps gaming's most ambitious and respectful treatment of Egyptian culture and mummification. Set in Ptolemaic Egypt, the game recreates the ancient world in stunning detail. Alexandria's great library, the pyramids in their prime, the busy streets of Memphis. Players learn about mummification practices, explore tombs designed based on actual archaeological knowledge, and encounter aspects of Egyptian religion and culture woven naturally into gameplay. The game includes a discovery tour mode specifically for education, allowing players to explore without combat and learn about historical sites, cultural practices, and daily life in ancient Egypt. Even casual mobile games embrace Egyptian themes. Pyramid Solitaire uses mummy and pharaoh imagery in its card designs. Match 3 games set in Egypt feature mummies, scarabs, and hieroglyphics as game elements. These games rarely engage deeply with actual Egyptian culture, but they demonstrate how thoroughly Egyptian aesthetics have permeated gaming consciousness. The visual language of pyramids, golden treasures, and wrapped mummies is universally recognized and instantly evocative of mystery and ancient power. Horror games use mummies differently, as sources of dread rather than adventure obstacles. In survival horror games, mummies might be nearly unkillable pursuers, forcing players to hide or flee rather than fight. The slow, inexorable approach of a mummy works beautifully in horror contexts, creating tension through anticipation. The knowledge that this thing will not stop, cannot be reasoned with, and will eventually reach you if you don't escape creates the kind of mounting dread that horror games thrive on. Puzzle games incorporate mummy themes in creative ways. Mummy Maze and similar games challenge players to navigate tomb corridors, avoiding or manipulating mummies to reach exits. These games often draw on the Sakaban tradition of block-pushing puzzles, but with Egyptian theming. The mummies follow predictable patterns, and success comes from understanding their behavior and using it to solve spatial challenges. It's a far cry from the supernatural horror of film Mummies, but it maintains the core concept of mummies as obstacles to overcome through intelligence rather than force. Educational games about ancient Egypt naturally incorporate mummification content. Mummy Maker, available through the BBC and other educational websites, walks players through the mummification process step by step, removing organs, drying the body with natron, wrapping in linen. It's gamified education, turning what could be dry historical information into interactive experience. Players learn the actual practices, while gaining appreciation for the complexity and care involved in real mummification. The indie gaming scene has produced creative spins on mummy mythology. Spelunky features mummies as enemies in temple levels. They appear when players disturb golden idols, adding consequences to greed. Crypt of the Necro Dancer includes mummies that move to the game's rhythm-based mechanics, creating enemies whose behavior syncs with the music. These games demonstrate how flexible the mummy concept is. It can be adapted to almost any game genre while maintaining its essential identity. Massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft include Egyptian-inspired zones with mummy enemies and mummification-themed quests. Players might help spirits complete their interrupted mummification, retrieve stolen canopic jars, or battle undead pharaohs seeking to extend their rule into the present. The social nature of MMOs allows for more complex storytelling, with mummies serving not just as enemies, but as quest givers, historical figures, or complex characters with motivations beyond simple hostility. What's fascinating about mummies in gaming is how the medium allows for experimentation with perspective and mechanics that other media can't match. Games can let you be the mummy, not just fight it. They can turn mummification into a puzzle-solving tool or a game mechanic. They can create entire worlds based on Egyptian mythology, where mummies are one element among many rather than the sole focus. The interactivity of gaming means players engage with mummy mythology actively rather than passively, making choices about how to approach tombs, whether to disturb graves, and how to deal with the consequences. The educational potential of gaming remains largely untapped. Imagine a game that teaches real Egyptian history, language, and culture through gameplay that feels like adventure rather than lesson. Imagine exploring historically accurate tombs, learning to read actual hieroglyphics to solve puzzles, understanding real religious beliefs through interactive narrative. Some games approach this goal, but there's room for much more. For games that respect both the entertainment value of Egyptian settings and the rich, complex reality of ancient Egyptian civilization. As gaming technology advances, we're seeing increasingly sophisticated treatments of Egyptian themes. Virtual reality allows players to explore tomb interiors with unprecedented immersion, examining wall paintings and artifacts in 3 dimensions. Advanced AI could create mummy characters with complex behaviors and motivations. Procedural generation could create infinite variations on tomb layouts and puzzles. The future of mummies in gaming likely includes experiences we can barely imagine today, continuing the decades-long tradition of gaming's fascination with ancient Egypt and its most famous form of preservation. Open any children's book about monsters, and there they are. Mummies shuffling alongside vampires, werewolves, and zombies in the pantheon of classic creatures that haunt our collective imagination. They've appeared in everything from Scooby-Doo cartoons to serious literary fiction, from comedy sketches to theme park attractions, from breakfast cereals to Halloween costumes. The mummy has become one of pop culture's most versatile and enduring symbols, representing everything from ancient mystery to comic absurdity, from supernatural horror to campy fun. The literature of mummies stretches back further than most people realize. Bram Stoker, famous for Dracula, also wrote The Jewel of 7 Stars in 1903, featuring an Egyptian mummy and a resurrection ritual gone wrong. This novel established many tropes that would persist throughout mummy literature. The obsessed archaeologist, the forbidden ancient magic, the price of tampering with forces beyond human understanding, and the Egyptian priestess whose power transcends death. Stoker understood that mummies worked as horror subjects precisely because they violated natural order. They were death that refused to stay still, corpses animated by will or magic or curse. Anne Rice, known primarily for vampire fiction, wrote The Mummy or Ramses the Damned, presenting an immortal pharaoh living in modern times. Her Ramses is sophisticated, conflicted, and deeply romantic, less monster than tragic hero cursed with eternal life. This sympathetic portrayal of an ancient Egyptian revived in modern times became increasingly common in literature, reflecting changing attitudes toward Egyptian culture and a desire for more complex monster characters who could carry novels rather than simply menacing protagonists for a few chapters. Children's literature has thoroughly domesticated the mummy. Books like I Want My Mummy and The Mummy's Gold present mummies as funny, friendly, or at worst slightly grumpy characters rather than terrifying monsters. Bunnicula includes a mummy cat among its cast of monster pets. These books recognize that children are fascinated by Egyptian culture and mummies, but need age-appropriate presentations that won't cause nightmares. The result is a whole subgenre of silly, sweet, or adventure-focused mummy stories, where the horror elements are stripped away entirely. Scooby-Doo has featured mummies in dozens of episodes across multiple series, making the animated mummy one of television's most frequently appearing versions of the creature. Almost invariably, the mummy turns out to be a person in a costume, a smuggler, a thief, or someone trying to scare people away from hidden treasure. This formula taught generations of children a useful lesson. Monsters are usually just people with ulterior motives. The Scooby-Doo mummy is identifiable by its distinctive shuffling walk, its tendency to groan, menacingly, and its inevitable unmasking to reveal a decidedly non-supernatural culprit. Abbott and Costello's Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, 1955, established the comedy horror approach to mummy movies. The film plays mummy mythology for laughs while still maintaining some spooky atmosphere. This balance, treating the mummy as both funny and potentially frightening, has been replicated countless times since. The key is recognizing that there's something inherently absurd about a slowly shuffling, bandage-wrapped corpse as a threat, while also acknowledging the genuine creepiness of animated dead pursuing the living. Steve Martin's 1978 comedy song, King Tut, became a surprise hit, turning Tutankhamun into a disco-era punchline. The song captured the wave of Tut mania that followed the touring exhibition of treasures from Tut's tomb. Exhibitions that broke attendance records worldwide and sparked renewed public fascination with ancient Egypt. Martin's song was silly and irreverent, but it also demonstrated how thoroughly Egyptian imagery had penetrated American popular culture. The fact that a comedian could write a song about a 3,000-year-old pharaoh and have it become a top 20 hit speaks to the deep cultural resonance of Egyptian mummies. Theme park attractions have long recognized the appeal of mummy experiences. Universal Studios' Revenge of the Mummy rides combine dark ride storytelling with roller coaster thrills, sending guests through collapsing tombs while being pursued by Imhotep and his minions. These rides blend elaborate sets, special effects, and physical thrills to create immersive experiences that wouldn't be possible in films or games. The controlled environment of a theme park allows for multi-sensory mummy encounters. The smell of burning torches, the heat of fire effects, the physical sensation of being pulled into the tomb's darkness. Disneyland's Matterhorn bobsleds originally featured a mummy-like snow creature, though it was later changed to a more Yeti-like abominable snowman. The Temple of the Forbidden Eye at Disneyland incorporates extensive Egyptian-inspired architecture and mythology, though it stops short of featuring actual mummies. These attractions demonstrate how mummy mythology and Egyptian aesthetics can be adapted to create thrilling experiences that respect cultural heritage while providing entertainment. Halloween has thoroughly adopted the mummy as one of its standard costume options. Children wrap themselves in toilet paper or buy pre-made mummy costumes, joining ghosts, witches, and vampires in the parade of spooky characters. The mummy costume is appealingly simple. It requires no makeup or complicated assembly, just wrapping, while still being instantly recognizable. Every October, countless mummies shuffle through neighborhoods trick-or-treating, the ancient Egyptian dead transformed into sugar-seeking suburban children. Mummy decorations proliferate during Halloween season. Inflatable mummies for front yards, mummy string lights, cardboard cutouts of pyramids and sarcophagi. Party games include mummy wrap races, where teams compete to wrap teammates in toilet paper as quickly as possible. These playful appropriations of mummy imagery are so ubiquitous that we rarely stop to think about what they represent. The transformation of genuine ancient funerary practices into party themes and costume ideas. Museum exhibitions of Egyptian artifacts and mummies represent a fascinating intersection of education, entertainment, and ethics. When King Tut's treasures toured internationally in the 1970s, they drew unprecedented crowds. People waited hours to see golden artifacts, and though no mummies were included in that particular tour, the association was clear. These exhibitions sparked waves of public interest in Egyptology, inspired countless students to study ancient cultures, and generated enormous revenue for museums and host cities. But they also raised uncomfortable questions. Is it appropriate to display human remains as museum exhibits? Would we display European royalty in glass cases the same way we display Egyptian pharaohs? Why does geographic and temporal distance make it acceptable to exhibit some people's ancestors, but not others? These questions have grown more pressing as awareness of indigenous rights, cultural sensitivity, and the legacies of colonialism have evolved. Some museums have responded by providing more context around mummy displays, explaining the religious significance of mummification, the cultural beliefs that motivated the practice, and the ethical considerations involved in exhibiting human remains. Others have removed mummies from display entirely or consulted with Egyptian authorities about appropriate presentation. The conversation continues to evolve as we grapple with the tension between the educational value of mummy exhibitions and the ethical imperative to treat the dead with respect. The commercialization of mummy imagery extends to products both respectful and ridiculous. Museum gift shops sell high-quality reproductions of Egyptian artifacts alongside cartoon mummy toys. Mummy-themed board games, video games, and educational materials aim to teach about ancient Egypt while entertaining. Less thoughtfully, mummy imagery appears on everything from beach towels to energy drinks, divorcing the symbol from any meaningful connection to the culture that created it. Comic books and graphic novels have found creative ways to use mummy characters. Marvel Comics introduced Encantu the Living Mummy in the 1970s, a warrior from ancient Egypt who was mummified alive and awakened in modern times with superhuman strength. DC Comics has featured various mummy characters, usually as villains, but occasionally as more nuanced figures. These comic book mummies often combine Egyptian mythology with superhero tropes, creating characters who bridge ancient and modern worlds. The enduring appeal of mummies in popular culture reflects several persistent human fascinations. We're drawn to ancient Egypt because it represents a civilization of extraordinary achievement and mystery, a culture that mastered architecture, art, mathematics, and medicine millennia ago, yet left behind puzzles we're still solving. We're fascinated by death and preservation because they touch on our own mortality and our hopes for some form of continued existence. We're attracted to curses and supernatural vengeance because they suggest that actions have consequences, that disrespecting the dead or violating sacred spaces carries real risks. But perhaps most fundamentally, mummies persist in popular culture because they're such versatile symbols. They can represent horror or history, comedy or tragedy, adventure or education. They can be monsters to be feared, puzzles to be solved, or windows into ancient worlds. A mummy can be whatever a story needs it to be. A shambling threat, a tragic figure, a comic relief character, or a serious subject for scholarly study. This flexibility ensures that mummies will continue to appear across all forms of media, constantly being reimagined and reinterpreted for new audiences and new purposes. Despite decades of sophisticated scientific study, mummies continue to surprise us with new discoveries and unsolved mysteries. Each technological advance reveals information that previous generations of researchers missed. Each new mummy discovered adds pieces to puzzles we didn't know were incomplete. The ancient dead keep teaching us, challenging our assumptions, and reminding us how much we still don't understand about past civilizations and the people who created them. One of the most persistent mysteries surrounds the famous curse of the Pharaohs, particularly the supposed curse on Tutankhamun's tomb. When Howard Carter opened the boy king's burial chamber in 1922, newspapers seized on the death of Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financial backer, as evidence of a supernatural curse. Never mind that Carnarvon died from an infected mosquito bite months after the tomb's opening, or that Carter himself lived for another 17 years, or that most of the expedition members enjoyed normal lifespans. The curse narrative proved too compelling to die, spawning countless books, movies, and conspiracy theories. Modern researchers have investigated whether there might be a rational basis for some curse-related deaths. Could ancient tombs harbor dangerous bacteria, fungi, or other pathogens that have survived for millennia? Studies have found various microorganisms in tomb environments, including some that could potentially cause illness in people with compromised immune systems. But the evidence doesn't support the idea that entering tombs carries significant health risks to normally healthy individuals. The curse, it seems, is purely cultural. A narrative we created because we needed mummies to be dangerous, needed there to be consequences for disturbing the dead. Yet the idea persists that mummies carry some form of curse or supernatural power. This belief reflects something deeper than simple superstition. It expresses our intuitive sense that violating tombs and disturbing human remains is transgressive, that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed regardless of scientific justification. The curse narrative gives voice to ethical concerns that we might otherwise struggle to articulate. Concerns about respecting the dead, honoring different cultural practices, and recognizing that not everything should be available for our examination and entertainment. DNA analysis continues to reveal surprises about ancient populations. Recent genetic studies of Egyptian mummies have shown more genetic continuity with modern Egyptians than previously thought, while also revealing connections to ancient populations throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. The genetic diversity of ancient Egypt was greater than sometimes assumed, reflecting the region's position as a crossroads of trade and migration. Each new genetic study refines our understanding of how populations moved, mixed, and evolved over thousands of years. But DNA analysis also raises profound questions about consent and privacy. These individuals never consented to having their genetic information extracted, analyzed, and published. Their descendants might have views about what's appropriate to study or reveal. As genetic technology advances, we'll be able to determine increasingly personal information from ancient DNA. Susceptibility to various diseases, physical characteristics, perhaps even behavioral predispositions. At what point does this cross lines of privacy and respect? These are questions the scientific community is still grappling with. Ongoing discoveries of new mummies continue to make headlines. Climate change, ironically, is revealing bodies that ice preserved for centuries or millennia as glaciers retreat. Construction projects occasionally uncover previously unknown burial sites. Even in well-studied areas like Egypt's Valley of the Kings, new tombs continue to be found. Each discovery has potential to add to our knowledge about mummification techniques, about forgotten individuals, about aspects of ancient life that previous evidence missed. Some of the most exciting recent discoveries have come from Peru, where dry desert conditions have preserved bodies and artifacts with remarkable completeness. Excavations continue to reveal new information about pre-Columbian cultures, including mummification practices that varied significantly between different Andean civilizations. These finds remind us that Egyptian mummies, while most famous, represent just one tradition among many, and that focusing exclusively on Egypt means missing the rich diversity of human approaches to death and preservation. The ethics of studying and displaying mummies has become increasingly important in archaeological and museum circles. Indigenous groups worldwide have fought for the repatriation of ancestral remains removed from burial sites during colonial-era expeditions. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, in the United States, has required museums to return many Native American remains to tribes for reburial. Similar conversations are happening regarding Egyptian mummies, bog bodies, and other ancient human remains displayed in museums worldwide. Some argue that mummies in museums serve important educational purposes, that they inspire interest in ancient cultures and provide irreplaceable research opportunities. Others counter that education doesn't require displaying actual human remains, that the same information can be conveyed through photographs, reconstructions, and artifacts. Some suggest compromise positions, displaying mummies with appropriate context and respect, consulting with descendant communities about appropriate treatment, or limiting display to individuals who specifically requested preservation and commemoration. There's no easy answer to these questions. Different cultures have different views on the appropriate treatment of the dead. The passage of time complicates matters. At what point do human remains become archaeological resources rather than individuals deserving of burial? Should temporal distance matter ethically? Or is it simply that we feel more comfortable disturbing people from cultures and times distant from our own? Future technology promises to reveal even more information from mummies without requiring destructive analysis. Advanced imaging techniques could allow us to virtually unwrap mummies, examining their contents in 3 dimensions without physically touching the remains. Improved DNA extraction methods might allow genetic analysis from smaller, less invasive samples. Machine learning could help identify patterns in mummy data that human researchers miss, potentially revealing new insights about health, diet, and social organization in ancient societies. But technology also raises new ethical questions. If we can extract someone's complete genome from ancient tissue, should we? If we can create perfect digital replicas of mummies, does that reduce the need to display the actual remains? If we can use facial reconstruction and animation technology to make ancient people appear to speak and move, is that respectful commemoration or disturbing manipulation? As our capabilities expand, our ethical frameworks must expand as well. The phenomenon of modern mummification continues, though in forms quite different from ancient practices. Vladimir Lenin's embalmed body has been on display in Moscow's Red Square since 1924, requiring constant maintenance and treatment to prevent decay. His preservation isn't technically mummification. It uses modern chemical treatments rather than ancient methods, but it serves similar purposes of allowing the dead leader to remain symbolically present. Similar preservation efforts have been undertaken for other political figures, including Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong. Cryonic preservation represents another modern attempt to achieve the ancient goal of defeating death through preservation. Companies offer to freeze bodies, or just heads at death, with the hope that future technology might allow resurrection and repair of whatever caused death. This isn't mummification. Cryonic preservation aims for eventual revival rather than eternal rest. But it reflects the same fundamental human desire to prevent death's finality, to preserve the body in hopes of continued existence. The future of mummy studies lies partly in what new discoveries will reveal, but also in how we choose to balance scientific inquiry with ethical respect. We're developing more sophisticated tools for non-invasive study, more nuanced understanding of ancient cultures, and more thoughtful approaches to the treatment of human remains. Each generation re-examines its relationship with the ancient dead, asking questions about what we owe to people long gone, what we have the right to study and display, and how we can honor ancient practices while pursuing modern knowledge. Perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding mummies isn't scientific but philosophical. What would the ancient embalmers think if they could see their work today? Would Egyptian priests be pleased that their carefully preserved pharaohs are known and studied worldwide, or horrified that sacred rest has been disturbed? Would they see museums as temples honoring their dead, or as violations of sacred space? Would they be proud that their mummification techniques inspire scientific admiration, or disturbed that religious practices have been reduced to museum displays? We'll never know the answers to these questions, but asking them is important. It reminds us that every mummy was a person, that every preserved body represents beliefs, relationships, and hopes of communities who care deeply about properly honoring their dead. The mysteries wrapped in linen include not just scientific puzzles but human stories. Tales of love and loss, of religious devotion and technological achievement, of societies that believed so strongly in life after death that they invested enormous resources in ensuring their dead could achieve it. As we continue studying mummies, making new discoveries, and grappling with ethical questions about their treatment, we participate in a conversation that spans millennia. We connect with ancient embalmers who pioneered preservation techniques, with families who mourned their dead and provided for their afterlives, with cultures that viewed death not as ending, but as transformation. In carefully studying these preserved bodies, in treating them with respect and dignity, in learning from them while honoring what they represented to their communities, we fulfill our own obligation to the dead, to remember them, to tell their stories, and to pass their legacy forward to future generations who will ask their own questions and make their own discoveries among the mysteries still wrapped in linen. Tonight, we've walked together through the shadows of ancient tombs and the flickering light of modern laboratories, following humanity's eternal quest to preserve what we love against the ravages of time. From the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, where the first accidental mummies inspired elaborate preservation rituals, to the frozen peaks of the Andes, where children were transformed into eternal guardians, and the transformation of mummies from sacred remains into cultural icons that populate our movies, games, and Halloween celebrations. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the wrapped and timeless world of mummies. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through our archives will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you rest peacefully knowing that the desire to preserve what we cherish is one of humanity's most beautiful impulses. And may you find comfort in the knowledge that memory and love can indeed transcend even the longest passage of time.